A quiet evening in a small suburban neighborhood outside Boston. Soft rain taps against the roof. Daniel Brooks, a 41-year-old single father, is clearing the table with his 9-year-old daughter, Emma. The house is peaceful, but heavy. 3 days ago, the house next door held a funeral. The neighbors moved in only months ago. Daniel didn't know them well. He only knew a young husband was gone. Suddenly, a knock. Daniel opens the door. A woman, 27 years old, stands there in a black coat. Her eyes are raw. She whispers, "I'm sorry. I didn't know who else to go to." Watch. Suburban Boston in late autumn is a landscape of muted colors and long shadows. For Daniel Brooks, life had become a predictable, rhythmic sequence of duty and devotion. At 41, his world was bounded by the walls of his modest home and the needs of his daughter, Emma. Daniel was an engineer by trade, a man who liked systems that worked and bridges that held. But the most important structure he had ever built was the life he provided for Emma after her mother, Sarah, had passed away 4 years ago. He was the quiet dad of the street, the one who mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings, fixed the neighborhood kids' bikes for free, and was always exactly on time for the school bus. He lived in a state of carefully managed survival. He didn't go to the bars. He didn't date. He stayed in the safe zone of fatherhood, believing that if he kept the routine tight enough, the silence of the house wouldn't feel so loud. But 3 months ago, the house next door, a charming Victorian that had sat empty for a year, was sold. A young couple moved in. They were vibrant, full of energy, and clearly in love. He saw them through his window. Mark, always carrying heavy boxes with a laugh, and Clara, who spent her first week planting marigolds in the front garden. They were the opposite of Daniel's world. They were a beginning. Then 2 weeks ago, the sirens came. A freak accident on the highway, a rainy night, a sudden patch of black ice. Mark never made it home. Daniel had watched from his porch as the police car pulled into the neighbor's driveway. He had heard the scream that cut through the night air, a sound that brought back every hospital corridor and every flatlining monitor from his own past. He wanted to go over, to say something, but he knew the weight of that first hour. He knew that words were useless when the world was currently shattering. The funeral was 3 days ago. Daniel had stood at the back of the cemetery, holding Emma's hand. He saw the crowds of family members and friends. He saw the flowers. He saw Clara, looking like a ghost in a black dress, staring at a patch of grass as if it were the edge of the universe. He expected that after the service, someone would stay. He assumed she had a mother, a sister, or a best friend who would occupy the spare room and keep the lights on. But this evening, as the rain turned from a drizzle to a steady downpour, Daniel looked out his kitchen window. The house next door was dark. No lights in the living room, no blue glow of a television. Just a single lamp in the hallway. "Dad?" Emma asked, drying a plate. "Is the lady next door okay? She's all alone now, isn't she?" Daniel paused, the scent of lemon soap filling the air. "I think she's having a very hard time, Emma. Loss is a big thing. It takes a long time to learn how to walk with it. I want to give her my drawing," Emma said, pointing to a watercolor of a bright yellow sun she had made at school. "She looks like she's in the dark." Daniel sighed, a heavy, empathetic ache in his chest. He was about to tell Emma that they should wait, that people need privacy in their grief, when the sound of the front door knocker echoed through the hallway. It wasn't a loud knock. It was hesitant, desperate, and rhythmic. He walked to the door, his heart rate ticking up. When he pulled it open, the cold wind rushed in, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and iron. Clara Vance stood there. She wasn't wearing a raincoat, just a thin black sweater. Her hair was damp, and her eyes were a terrifying shade of red. She looked like a person who had been staring at a wall for 72 hours and had finally realized the wall wasn't going to talk back. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. I tried to stay, I tried to sleep, but the house, it's too quiet. I didn't know who else to go to. Everyone else, they have homes to go back to. I'm the only one left in mine." Daniel looked at her and didn't see a stranger. He saw himself 4 years ago. He saw the exact moment when the support leaves and the reality of the forever silence begins. He didn't ask her if she was okay. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply stepped back and opened the door wide. "Come in, Clara," Daniel said. "The tea is just about ready, and Emma has something she's been wanting to show you." Clara stepped into the hallway, her movements stiff, like a bird with a broken wing. She stopped near the coat rack, looking around the warm, messy entryway of Daniel's home as if she were in a dream. The air in Daniel's house smelled of cinnamon, old books, and the faint, lingering scent of a home-cooked meal. To a woman who had been living in the sterile, suffocating vacuum of a fresh tragedy, the normalcy of the room was almost an assault on her senses. Daniel took her coat. It was heavy with rain. He realized then that she must have been standing on her own porch for a long time before she found the courage to walk the 20 feet to his door. "Emma!" Daniel called out, his voice a low, grounding anchor. "Can you get the blanket from the sofa? Our neighbor's a bit cold." Emma appeared instantly, her eyes wide with a quiet, 9-year-old wisdom. She didn't ask questions. She didn't stare. She simply handed Clara a thick knitted blue throw and pointed to the armchair near the fireplace. "You can sit here," Emma said softly. "It's the warmest spot. Dad says the fire tells the best stories." Clara sat. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, her hands still trembling. She looked at the small fire crackling in the hearth. For 5 minutes, no one spoke. Daniel went to the kitchen and poured a cup of herbal tea, adding a spoonful of honey. The way Sarah used to like it when the world felt too heavy. He brought it to her, setting it on the side table. "You don't have to talk, Clara," Daniel said, sitting on the sofa across from her. "You don't have to explain anything. The silence in this room is shared. It's not yours to carry alone tonight." Clara looked at the steam rising from the cup. A single tear, large and slow, escaped her eye and fell onto the blue wool of the blanket. Then another. She wasn't sobbing. She was leaking. It was the soundless, exhausted crying of someone who had run out of screams. "The funeral was 3 days ago," she finally said, her voice cracking. "My sister left this morning. My parents went back to New York. They told me I should get some rest. They told me I needed to be strong. But how do you be strong when the person who gave you strength is in a box in the ground?" I walked into the kitchen to make coffee, and I saw his half-finished crossword puzzle on the counter. I couldn't move, Daniel. I stood there for 2 hours just looking at his handwriting. I realized I don't know how to be in that house without him. Daniel nodded slowly. He remembered the first time he had to throw away Sarah's half-used bottle of shampoo. It had felt like a murder. He remembered the way the air in the bedroom felt like it had been replaced with lead. "People mean well when they tell you to be strong," Daniel said, "but they're usually just afraid of your weakness. Strength isn't about standing up right now. Strength is just surviving the next 10 minutes. And if you can't do that alone, you shouldn't have to." Emma walked over and sat on the floor near Clara's feet. She pulled out her watercolor sun. "I made this for you," she said, holding it up. "It's a yellow sun. Even if it's raining outside, the sun is still there. It's just hiding behind the clouds for a little bit." Clara took the drawing, her fingers tracing the bright, messy edges of the paint. For the first time that night, the corners of her mouth twitched into a ghost of a smile. "It's beautiful, Emma. Thank you." As the evening wore on, the tension in Clara's shoulders began to dissipate. She didn't leave. She didn't check the time. She just sat in the warmth, watching Emma play with a puzzle on the rug. Daniel stayed nearby, reading a book but not really seeing the words. He was providing a non-anxious presence, a concept he had learned in the long, dark years after Sarah's death. He realized that Clara didn't need a counselor. She didn't need a religious sermon. She needed a witness. She needed to know that someone saw her in the middle of the wreckage and wasn't trying to pull her out before she was ready. She needed to know that the single dad next door understood the frequency of her pain. At 10 p.m., Emma began to yawn. Daniel stood up. "I should go," Clara said, her voice sounding a little more grounded. "I've stayed too long. You have a school morning tomorrow." "Stay as long as you need," Daniel replied, "but Emma does need to get to bed. If you're not ready to go back to the house yet, you can stay here on the sofa. I have plenty of blankets." Clara looked at the door, then back at the fire. The thought of that dark Victorian next door, with the half-finished crossword and the empty pillow, seemed to physically hurt her. "If you don't mind," she whispered, "just for tonight, I don't think I can walk through that door again in the dark." Daniel helped her set up the sofa. He didn't make it a big deal. He didn't ask for a thank you. He simply gave her a safe place to breathe. As he walked up the stairs with Emma, he realized that for the first time in 4 years, the silence in his own house didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a sanctuary he was finally sharing with someone else who knew the value of a quiet light. The following weeks were defined by a new, unspoken routine. Clara didn't move in, but she was rarely gone. Every evening, around the time Daniel started dinner, there would be a light knock at the back door. Sometimes she brought a dish she had tried to cook, usually something simple, like a salad or a tray of cookies. And sometimes she just brought herself. She became a fixture at their kitchen table. At first, she talked about the logistics of death. She spoke about the insurance papers, the bank accounts, and the terrifying piles of mail addressed to a dead man. Daniel listened, offering practical advice on how to navigate the bureaucracy of grief. He showed her his own folder of things no one tells you, a collection of notes he had kept when he was drowning in Sarah's estate. But as the days turned into weeks, the conversations moved from the legal to the lyrical. Clara began to talk about Mark, not the deceased husband, but the man. She spoke about the way he always forgot his keys. She spoke about his dream of building a woodworking shop in the garage. She spoke about the house they had bought together, how they had planned to paint the nursery seafoam green one day. "We had 40 years planned, Daniel," she said one night, staring into her coffee. "We had names for children we hadn't even conceived yet. We had a list of national parks we were going to visit when we turned 50. How do you just delete a future?" Daniel leaned back, his eyes reflecting a deep, pained understanding. "You don't delete it, Clara. You just stop expecting it to arrive. It's like a book that gets cut off mid-sentence. You'll always wonder what the next chapter was, but eventually, you realize the chapters that were written are still yours. They don't go away just because the pen broke." Emma was the bridge that kept them from sinking too deep into the sorrow. She would drag Clara into her world of school projects and imaginary games. She would ask Clara for help with her art or show her how to properly feed the neighborhood squirrels. In Emma's eyes, Clara wasn't a widow. She was a friend who was sad. And children have a way of treating sadness with a directness that adults are too polite to use. "Do you miss him in your tummy?" Emma asked one afternoon while they were coloring. Clara paused, a purple crayon in her hand. "I do, Emma. It feels like a big, empty hole right here." "Dad has a hole too," Emma said, not looking up. "But he put a lot of flowers in his. He says the flowers don't make the hole go away, but they make it easier to look at." Clara looked at Daniel, who was standing at the sink, his back to them. She saw the stiffness in his shoulders. She realized then that Daniel hadn't just been helping her. He had been reliving his own war. He was a veteran of this pain, and he was using his own scars to guide her through the dark. As the first snow began to fall over Boston, the bond deepened into something more than just neighborly help. Clara started dropping by on Saturday mornings. She helped Daniel rake the last of the leaves. She helped Emma with her costume for the school play. In return, Daniel helped her winterize her house. He fixed the drafty window in her bedroom. He cleared the snow from her driveway before she even woke up. There were no grand romantic gestures, no candlelit dinners. It was something much more profound. It was the reconstruction of a soul. Daniel realized that he wasn't just giving to Clara, he was receiving something in return. For 4 years, he had been the protector. He had been the one everyone relied on. But with Clara, he could finally be a man who understood. He could share the stories of Sarah that Emma was too young to hear. He could admit that he still sometimes looked at the door, expecting Sarah to walk through it. One evening, after Emma had gone to bed, they sat on the back porch, wrapped in heavy coats, watching the snow blanket the yard. "Why did you stay, Daniel?" Clara asked. "I mean, after she died. You could have moved. You could have started over somewhere where the walls didn't have her memories." Daniel looked at the fence between their houses. Because the memories aren't the problem, Clara. The silence is. And you can't run away from silence. You carry it with you. I stayed because this was the world we built. And I wanted Emma to know that even when something breaks, the foundation is still solid. I stayed because I didn't want to leave her behind. I'm afraid, Clara whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. I'm afraid that if I stop feeling this pain every second, if I start to enjoy the tea or the puzzle, it means I'm leaving him. It feels like betrayal. Daniel turned to her, his hazel eyes clear and steady. Moving on isn't leaving him behind, Clara. It's carrying him with you into the next room. You're not abandoning Mark. You're just learning how to live in a world where he is a part of you, rather than a person next to you. He wouldn't want you to stay in the dark just to prove you loved him. He already knows you do. Clara leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder. It was the first time they had touched in a way that wasn't purely accidental. It was a gesture of absolute, unshielded trust. The invisible dad and the broken neighbor were no longer alone in the cold. They had found the frequency of shared survival. And in the quiet of the Boston night, the snow continued to fall, covering the old world in a layer of white, ready for a new set of footprints. The month of December brought a cruel kind of beauty to the neighborhood. The houses were decorated with twinkling lights, and the sound of carols echoed from the local park. For the regular families, it was a season of joy. For Clara, it was a minefield of firsts. The first Christmas without him, the first New Year's Eve spent staring at a silent phone. She began to retreat. The knocks at Daniel's door became less frequent. She spent more time with her curtains drawn. Daniel noticed the change instantly. He knew the holiday trap, the way the world's happiness acts as a magnifying glass for your own misery. One Tuesday evening, Daniel walked over to her house. He didn't knock. He had a key now, given to him by Clara for emergencies. He walked into the kitchen and found her sitting on the floor in front of an open closet, surrounded by Mark's sweaters. She was holding a blue flannel shirt to her face, her eyes closed. "The smell is fading, Daniel," she whispered, not looking up. "I can barely find him anymore." "If the smell goes, he's really gone, isn't he?" Daniel sat on the floor beside her. He didn't try to pull her up. He didn't tell her to stop. He simply sat in the mess of fabric with her. "The smell of Sarah's perfume lasted about 6 months," Daniel shared, his voice soft. "I used to spray it on her pillow just to pretend. But then I realized I didn't need the smell to remember the way she looked when she was angry at a bad movie. I didn't need the shirt to remember her laugh." Clara looked at him, her face pale. "I'm so scared, Daniel. I'm scared that one day I'll wake up and I won't remember the exact shade of his eyes. I'm scared that if I go back to work, if I start a new project, I'm saying it's okay that he's gone. It's not okay." "It will never be okay," Daniel said firmly. "That's the secret. You don't get over it. You don't find closure. You just find a way to build a life around the loss. You're not leaving him, Clara. You're becoming the person he would be proud of. You're the living proof that he existed. Every time you smile, he's there. Every time you plant a marigold, he's there." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the scars on his own palm. "I felt the same way when I first started laughing at Emma's jokes again. I felt like a traitor. But then I saw Emma's face, and I realized that Sarah wasn't in the closet or the perfume bottle. She was in the girl who was finally seeing her dad come back to life. Mark is waiting for you to come back to life too." Clara leaned into him, the blue flannel shirt still clutched in her other hand. For the first time in months, she let out a long, shuddering breath that wasn't a sob. It was a release. She realized that Daniel wasn't just her neighbor. He was her mirror. He was showing her that it was possible to be broken and still be a harbor. "You're carrying him with you," Daniel repeated. "He's not behind you. He's inside you. And that means you can go anywhere. You don't have to stay in this closet to be close to him." Clara looked around the room. She saw the drafty window Daniel had fixed. She saw the drawing Emma had given her, pinned to the refrigerator. She saw the life that was still happening right outside her door. "I want to be able to breathe again," Clara whispered. "Then let's start with dinner," Daniel smiled. "Emma is trying to make a special salad involving marshmallows and grapes. I think we're going to need your help to prevent a culinary disaster." Clara laughed, a real vibrant sound that seemed to chase the shadows out of the corners of the kitchen. She stood up, folded the blue shirt carefully, and placed it back on the shelf. She wasn't leaving Mark behind. She was just closing the closet door for the night. As she walked with Daniel toward his house, the snow was falling softly, but the house didn't look so dark anymore. She was starting to see the flowers in the hole. Spring arrived in Boston with a sudden green ferocity. The ice on the Charles River melted, and the marigolds in Clara's garden began to poke their heads through the soil. The neighborhood was waking up, and so was Clara. She had gone back to her job as a freelance editor. She had repainted the hallway. She had even started hosting a small book club in her living room. The house next door was no longer a tomb, it was a home again. It still had the crossword puzzle, now framed and hanging on the wall, but the silence was no longer heavy. One evening, there was a knock at Daniel's door, but it wasn't the hesitant, desperate knock of a rainy autumn night. It was a rhythmic, cheerful staccato. Daniel opened the door. Clara stood there, wearing a bright green dress and a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. She was holding a steaming casserole dish. "I brought dinner," she announced. "And no, there are no marshmallows in this one. It's an actual adult lasagna." Emma came running from the living room, her face lighting up. "Clara, you're smiling. Your eyes aren't red anymore." Clara knelt down and hugged Emma tight. "The sun came back out, pal, just like you said it would." Daniel leaned against the doorframe, watching them. He saw the way Clara moved, with a lightness and a confidence he hadn't seen since the first week she moved in. He saw the way she looked at him, not as a savior, but as a partner. "You look well, Clara," Daniel said, his voice warm. "I feel present," she replied, stepping into the hallway. "I still have my bad days, Daniel. I still have the nights where the silence gets a bit too loud, but I'm not afraid of them anymore. I know where the door is, and I know who's on the other side of it." They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, sharing the lasagna and talking about the upcoming school year. There was no mention of accidents or funerals. There was only the sound of forks against plates and the easy, comfortable chatter of people who had navigated the storm together. Daniel realized then that he hadn't just helped Clara survive. By opening his door that night, he had allowed himself to come back to life too. He was no longer just the single dad in a state of managed survival. He was a man who had found a new kind of family in the most unexpected place. As the sun set over the suburban street, casting a long golden glow over the two houses, Daniel knew that the journey wasn't over. But for the first time in years, he wasn't worried about the silence, because he knew that as long as the door stayed open, no one would ever have to carry the dark alone again. True healing. It isn't found in the words we say. It's found in the doors we open. It's found in the simple, quiet decision to stay until the sun comes back out. Daniel Brooks and Clara Vance were no longer just neighbors. They were proof that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is to simply not leave. Grief is not a problem to be solved, but an experience to be shared. Sometimes the most powerful way to help someone who is hurting is not to give advice, but to provide a safe space where they don't have to be okay. Presence is the ultimate language of empathy, and an open door can be the first step back to life. If you believe that sometimes just being there is enough, subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments, have you ever helped someone just by not leaving? What was the moment that changed everything?